Good afternoon. This is Walter Edgar, continuing our series on South Carolina, and last time we talked about Charleston on the eve of the Revolution, and several of you have asked me, where did I get my statistics for that lecture? There was a book written by an Ivy League professor back 35, 40 years ago called The Wealth of a Nation to Be by Alice Hanson Jones. It's not a great read. The statistics are wonderful, but if you have trouble with insomnia, I recommend it very highly. But I wanted to clear it up. This was not local boys making South Carolina look so well. It's the cold statistics assembled by a New England professor. I'm going to skip from 1774 to after the Revolution now, because I've already done a lecture for a bunch of you out here at Still Hopes. And we've got 10 topics. So we're going to talk about South Carolina after the Revolution and a period that I've often called a quest for order or a struggle for order. War had left South Carolina in shambles. The white population of just about 100,000 owed almost $100 million in debt in today's money. The human losses were greater. There were lots of widows. And although destruction was everywhere, it was heaviest in the back country, now evolving into the middle country and the up country. Today we call it the Midlands, but back then they called it the middle country. Actually, that's a much nicer name. Economic recovery from the war was slow. There was social disorder, just as there had been after the Cherokee War, and economic problems caused even law and order types to break the law. Low country planters overextended themselves, purchasing lots of slaves to replace those lost in the war, and they bought them on credit. In fact, 25,000 enslaved persons had been lost during the war, most of them taken by the British and off. Poor harvests, low prices, losses of markets led to financial distress. British merchants and a number of Tories came back to Charleston and held the debts, and that was part of the problem. You've got people who were pro-British, and all of a sudden they have your debt and they're pressing you to make payment. Upcountry farmers and planters faced similar problems. Tax revenues plummeted as no one had money. District eastward of the Wateree, for example, in 1785, they paid $82,000 in taxes, collected that much. The year after, they only collected $8,800. And St. Paul's, down on the coast, present-day Colleton County, roughly, the tax receipts went from $236,000 to zero. Debtors ignored court orders, harassed court officials, and in fact, in one case, a sitting judge was made to eat a foreclosure document. In Charleston, the economic distress led to class conflict. The Sons of Liberty, who had helped gin up the revolution, mostly the artisan class, were hurt by British Tory merchants who were welcomed back by the old low country elite. There were literally riots in the streets, and the elite were tarred as Tory sympathizers. It was a real threat to law and order. And in fact, at one point, the city of Charleston called out the artillery to threaten a mob. The General Assembly sort of diffused the situation by giving Charleston city government for the first time in history, and artisans were elected to city council. And in 1785, Governor Grimke ordered all Tories who had been exiled to leave South Carolina. This and the city council helped ameliorate conditions. And then there was debtor legislation. My banker friends have gone crazy every time I talk about this. The Sheriff Sale Act, frequently referred to as the Pine Barren Act of 1785, allowed debtors to repay notes in land, often at inflated prices. Let's just say you're a planter somewhere, anywhere, Charleston County, Berkeley County, Beaufort, and you owe a lot of money. Well, you get a land grant legally somewhere in the backcountry. Let's just say around here, the wonderful sand hills of South Carolina. Then you get a local surveyor to put a price tag on them, just about the amount of money that you owe. Now, what kind of price is somebody going to get for the sand hills for a rather large debt? And then the General Assembly issued paper money that was backed by silver, and at 7% interest. It was supposed to be retired after immediately, but it was still in circulation at the turn of the 19th century. And it was used to pay taxes, but it kept money in circulation. And because there were so many complaints by people who owned your debt about the Pine Barren Act, that the General Assembly passed another piece of legislation called the Installment Act of 1787. It postponed final payments on all debts in South Carolina prior to March 1787 until 1790. 3-year postponement. And a debtor had 3 years, could make 3-year payments, installments, to get rid of the debt. And the slave trade was banned for 3 years, extended repeatedly until 1803 to remove the temptation for low country planters to go into debt by buying more slaves. But because of the ill will between the low country and the up country and the growing population of the up country, the General Assembly decided we'll toss them, those folks in the back country, a hush puppy. And the first thing they did was to create counties and county courts, and in 1785 agreed to move the capital to Columbia. Now, what about South Carolina's relation with the new United States? Well, we had a big role in that. There was a constitutional convention called for Philadelphia between May and September 1787. The General Assembly elected the delegates. Charles Pinckney, his first cousin, once removed, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Pierce Butler, and John Rutledge. As the late George Rogers said, Charleston was represented in Philadelphia, but not South Carolina. Charles Pinckney was the second youngest man in Philadelphia and very likely the wealthiest. All of these men had had experience with government at state or the national level. They had been in Congress either before the Revolution or during and afterwards with the Articles of Confederation. And all were wealthy conservatives from the Low Country. And what kind of role did they play in Philadelphia? Some people gave Charles Pinckney credit for actually drafting the plan that would become our Constitution. Others say his claims are overblown and used to tease him about being Constitution Charlie. All 4 men were active participants in convention debates. John Rutledge was a member of the Committee of Detail. That sounds pretty boring, but that drafted the document that was debated during August and September and eventually became the Constitution. On the question of the executive, Butler and Charles Pinckney argued forcefully for a vigorous executive. In terms of representation, Charles Pinckney didn't want the House of Representatives elected popularly. Let the legislatures do it. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney seconded his cousin, saying rural voters were too scattered to make elections meaningful. And then John Rutledge said, you should base the number of representatives based upon taxes paid. The wealth of the state, that's how somebody should be represented. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts replied, if taxation were the basis, then what about slaves? Blacks are property, he said, and are used to the southward as horses and cattle to the northward. Why shouldn't horses and cattle have right to representation in the north if slaves have representation in the south? The result of all this debate was the famous 3/5 compromise, where slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person in determining representation in the House of Representatives. And during that debate, South Carolinians made it quite clear where they stood. Rutledge said, the real issue in terms of this compromise is whether the southern states shall not be parties to this union. Charles Pinckney was the only delegate in Congress to make a moral justification of slavery, and he did so on the historical grounds by saying it had existed in Greece, Rome, and the English, French, and Spanish empires. Charles Cosworth Pinckney said, Georgia and South Carolina cannot do without their slaves. A side note on something that didn't happen and probably should have been, Charles Pinckney and James Madison tried to have a national university created in the Constitution. The ratification, as you all know, there are 13 colonies, or excuse me, now 13 states, all with very diverse interests. It was Butler, Pierce Butler of South Carolina, who said once 9 states approve of the document, it goes into effect. It does not have to be unanimous. This was a pretty sly move because they thought one state might say no and then defeat the whole enterprise. And almost every person there at Philadelphia understood we needed to have a central government that was better than the Congresses that we had been trying to live under. In South Carolina, there was a special ratification convention, and it was apportioned the same way as the General Assembly, which meant that most of the members were from the Low Country. The back country, almost to a man, to a delegate, were against the ratification of the Constitution. The final vote was 149 to 73 in favor. The overwhelming majority of the backcountry delegates voted no. Edanis Burke, who was a judge from the backcountry, had a famous quotation about the Constitution and the ratification in South Carolina. He said, "It is now unnecessary perhaps to state to you the different causes whereby the Constitution has been carried in South Carolina, notwithstanding 4/5 of the people do from their souls detest it. We had no principle of concert of union, while its friends and abettors left no expedient untried to push it forward. All of the rich leading men along the seacoast and rice settlements, with few exceptions, lawyers, physicians, and divines, the merchants, mechanics, the populace, and the mob of Charleston, add to this the whole weight of the influence of the press. In the interior of the country, all is disgust and sorrow, and vindictive reproaches against the system and those who voted for it. It is true the ratification was solemnized in Charleston with splendid procession and show. We hear from the backcountry, however, that in some places the people had a coffin painted black, which borne in procession, funeral procession, was solemnly buried as an emblem of the dissolution and interment of public liberty. On the present business, Virginia and New York adopting it, they will proceed to put it into motion, and then you and I and all of us will be obliged to take it as we take our wives, for better or for worse." Not very politically correct, but a nice 18th century observance on the Constitution. South Carolina decided it needed to have a constitution. If we got a new federal constitution, we'll have to have one of our own. And so in 1790, they did have a constitutional convention. Almost no concessions made to the backcountry, or the upcountry as it is now called, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the white population lived there. Columbia was affirmed as the state capital, but this constitution required state offices, 2 state offices. If you were Surveyor General, you had to maintain an office in Columbia and an office in Charleston, because it might just be too inconvenient from people from Charleston or Beaufort to have to go to Columbia to take business. And that's something that existed up until after the Civil War. Now, the Constitution, neither the state nor the federal makes any application or provision for parties, but very quickly in the new nation, parties did form. Those who supported the Constitution were called Federalists, and those who opposed, at first, Anti-Federalists, and then they became Jeffersonians. South Carolina's low country elite was very much in favor of the Federalist Party. In fact, Thomas Pinckney was nominated for vice president on their ticket in 1796 and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney in 1800. By the late 1790s, most upcountry voters and a surprising number of low country voters were backing Thomas Jefferson and his new party. And so the fact that there were South Carolinians on the ticket for the Federalists didn't make any difference. With national power shifting to upcountry leaders, the low country elite was in a dilemma. They had to decide to toss another hush puppy to the backcountry. This hush puppy was the South Carolina College, created in 1801. As was said in its enabling legislation, the power of the state was thenceforward to be in the upper country, and we desired our future rulers to be educated men, to create a united ruling elite. It worked. South Carolina College alumni dominated politics and almost completely until the Civil War. But this didn't really resolve the main issue, the apportionment of the General Assembly. And this reapportionment issue festered from 1790 until it was resolved in 1808. 20% of the population made laws for 80% of the population. Charleston District alone had 11% of the population and 40% of the representation in the House and 35% of the representation in the Senate. St. Stephen's, with 226 whites, had 3 members of the House and 1 senator. Edgefield District, with 9,785 residents, and Pendleton, with 8,731, had the same. 1 vote in St. Stephen's was worth 43 in Edgefield and 38 in Pendleton. The Low Country argued, we pay most of the taxes, 77% to 23%. The Upcountry said, people, not taxes. But representatives were not even apportioned according to taxes. The reps were 5-1 to the Low Country, taxes 3-1. It was heated debate during the 1790s, and it's often bitter. Today, you don't hear much talk about Low Country, Upcountry, but I can tell you until the 1980s, it still surfaced in politics. The images of the 2 sections that were created through the press, through pamphlets, through debate in the 1790s pretty much lingered well into the 21st century. The Low Country was rich, prodigal, even decadent, lazy, unhealthy, economic stagnation. The Upcountry was vigorous, healthy, industrial, frugal, and growing. And then you have issues of the French Revolution, and Haiti and slavery factored into this. Demographics had a lot to do with how things changed. By the 1790s, every member of the General Assembly from the Upcountry was a slave owner. The spread of slavery to the middle districts often voted with the Low Country rather than the Upcountry. Common interests, not geography. And the development of cotton spurred economic growth and expansion of slavery. By 1800, 1/3 of the enslaved persons in South Carolina were in the Upcountry. By 1810, it was 44%. And just some examples. Camden District in 1790 had 8,900 slaves. In 1800, 10 years later, it had 18,000. And by 1810, it had, 8,900 in 1790, 18,000 in 1800, 33,000 in 1810. 96, very upcountry, had 11,000 slaves in 1790, 19,000 in 1800, and 34,000 in 1810. In 1800, the number of white residents of the Low Country was 33,800. The Upcountry, 161,000. Joseph Alston of Georgetown became an unexpected champion of reapportionment. And so South Carolina came up with what was called the Compromise of 1808. Alston argued for representation based upon population. The Low Country elite dug in its heels and said apportionment should be based upon population and taxable wealth. The Low Country elite won. 1/2 of the seats in the House would be apportioned according to the white population. 1/2 of the seats in the House, it's 62 in each, apportioned according to taxable wealth. That meant that in 1808, slave owners still had a larger voice than yeoman farmers. Every parish or district got one senator, except for Charleston, of course, it got 2. The compromise passed by the General Assembly in 1808 also called for the reapportionment of the legislature every 10 years, and that happened all the way up till 1860. So you now began a sharing of power, interests as well as people represented, and this was often used by John C. Calhoun in his debates on ways to maintain political harmony and unity. Older histories say that the Upcountry won, but in reality it was a triumph of the Black Belt districts, not a question of sections. And I'm going to show you a chart that carries this forward, called the expanding power of the Black Belt. You can see in 1810 in the Senate, Black Belt counties, and those are counties with a black majority. They are already a majority in the Senate. And trace the growth of those Black Belt majority counties till you get to 1860. We have 46 representative districts or parishes. 36 have a black majority. In the House, it starts off with white majority districts in the majority. By 1830, Black Belt, and by 1860, overwhelming. So the Low Country elite eventually, or slave-owning population, eventually triumphed throughout the state. South Carolina, interestingly enough, right on the heels of this compromise, abolished property qualifications for voting, and any adult white male could vote. It was the first state in the United States to grant true universal white male suffrage. The Low Country elite had yielded grudgingly, and only when they thought that their interests would be safe. They were disdainful of upcountry folks. In the 1850s, they talked about they lacked polish, refinement, and delicacy. Increased ties between the two sections over time helped bridge the gap. The role of cotton and the need for slaves boosted fortune of existing planters and created new planters. For a generation, the Compromise of 1808 created political harmony in South Carolina that would last for a generation. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and I look forward to one next week.